Brandon Tilley works on Fluxxor, a set of tools to facilitate building JavaScript data layers using the Flux architecture. Brandon, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Thanks so much. I appreciate you having me.
How did you first get into React?
I think, like a lot of people, I first read about React in, like on Reddit on our JavaScript or something similar. And I took a look at the homepage, and I was like, "What's this angle bracket thing that's going on in here?" And so I kind of, unfortunately, I dismissed it, in the beginning and forgot about it. And a little while later, one of the guys at GitHub that works on Atom sent me a message like, "Hey, have you seen this React thing?" And I was like, "No, it was kind of weird. I didn't really like it." And he said, "Well, there's some good ideas in there. You should really check it out." So I gave it a second look, and I'm really glad I did, because I've been kind of in love with it ever since.
So did the things that you initially were appalled by, did those eventually end up charming you?
Absolutely. JSX is the big one, and I think it's one that people talk about a lot. But I can't imagine, I really can't imagine writing those sorts of UIs without JSX. It's just such a natural way to do that sort of composition.
Why is JSX so crucial to the React workflow?
I think for me, it sort of lowers the overhead between thinking about, at least on the web, the DOM that you're creating and the JavaScript objects that you're creating. It's a very sort of one-to-one mapping. When you're, doing something like handlebars templating, then there's a completely different language, that you're using with a different set of idioms and a different set of tools. And with JSX, you've got, a very low difference between what you see in the DOM and what you see in your editor. And you also get to use all of the JavaScript idioms that you're already used to using with other data structures.
Once you were won over by, I guess, the idiosyncrasies of React, did you start using it in some personal projects, or did you start using it at work, or what was the adoption pattern for you?
Yeah, I definitely started playing with it on personal stuff first. I think the first real thing I built with it was a Chrome extension that's up on the Chrome Web Store. I have a problem with tabs. I have a lot of them. And I built a little Chrome extension that would let you do like a fuzzy search through all your tabs. And I decided to build that with React. And really, really enjoyed that experience. And I think that's what really sold me on its capabilities.
That's really cool. This is kind of a detour, but how do you build a browser extension?
Yeah, it's actually, it was very straightforward and very similar to kind of regular web development. This particular extension has a JavaScript file that kind of runs in the background, watching for, button presses and that sort of thing. And when you hit the hotkey that's assigned to the extension, it actually just displays a window, which has a web page in it. And that web page has the React bundle with the application code. And then the only thing that's really special about it is that there are, JavaScript objects available to the page that can communicate with, Chrome and the rest of your extension via, message passing. So basically, every time you open or close a page, I keep track of what tabs are open, and when the web page opens that has the tab list in it, it just contacts the Chrome extension and grabs that whole list and displays them for you.
Fascinating. So you don't need to know anything other than JavaScript in order to write a browser extension.
Yeah, absolutely. I was surprised and pleased with kind of how straightforward the whole thing was.
Yeah, I assumed there was some C++ involved, but I guess that's naive. Anyway, but since working on hobby projects, have you begun using React at work, or I have no idea what you do, by the way. What is your job?
Sure, yeah, I work at the Minerva Project, which is a new undergraduate university. We do our classes online, but not in the sort of online classes you would normally think of. We have a real-time audio-video platform that we've built. You can think about it like Google Hangouts, but with more of an education and real-time data sharing kind of bent to it. And some of the associated tooling that I've written for the university is written in React, and that's actually
very cool. That's a cool project.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. We get to play with a lot of interesting WebRTC technologies and that sort of thing.
Yeah, are you rethinking anything around online learning? Because like I think that's a really interesting space to be hacking at.
Yeah, it is really interesting, and again, online learning is a little bit of a misnomer. Our students actually they travel the world over their 4-year education. They start off in San Francisco, and then each semester after that, they'll travel to a different country together. But the classes are presented online, and the big idea is like, what if we could take an Ivy League university and rebuild it knowing what we know today about the science of learning and being able to utilize technology rather than most universities just find a way to work university into the learning experience. And we wanted a way to really utilize technology to go above and beyond what we could do in a real-time class, in a face-to-face classroom.
That's really fascinating. Well, I guess we should get into talking about Flux. When did you start getting interested in Flux? When did your interest in React blossom into the adjacent interest in Flux?
That was actually a relatively short period of time, I guess a couple of months. As I started getting more into React, there was this definite feeling that something was missing. Like, obviously, React is just really kind of a view layer concern, and you could put all your data in state, but that it just felt wrong. And, different people were talking about how in larger applications, the data management got a little bit harder to deal with, or you ended up passing props through multiple subcomponents that they didn't even need the props just so that some eventual child could get those properties. And when Facebook started talking about Flux a couple of months after I started using React, I was like, oh, this is it. This is the thing that sounds like exactly what I'm looking for.
Right. And so we've discussed Flux several times on this show, but it is a significant paradigm shift, and I'd like to get another explanation of it from you. What is Flux?
Sure. So in my mind, Flux is really made up of one or two really core rules, which are designed to make the data flow in your application easy to reason about, and bugs around, global application state changing easy to find and to fix. And those two rules are, one, you have these things called stores, which you can kind of think as the models of the data piece of your application, but they hold all of the application state that's not transient, that's not like what the user is doing at the time, like the menu's open or closed, that sort of thing. And the important thing about the stores is that only a store is allowed to change its data, so there's no setters on the store. And the second important rule is the only reason that a store will ever change its state is because it responded to an action. And an action is just a description of some semantic intent in your application, like add a comment or delete a comment. You're not telling the store how to add a comment or how to delete a comment. You're just telling, hey, if there's a store out there that cares about comments, please add or delete a comment. And the store is responsible for actually doing the data mutation. And any bug in your application state logic ends up really being localized to the dispatch of that action to the stores or the way the stores handle that action.
Can you talk about that in more specificity? How does Flux make the bugs easier to track down and fix?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, a lot of it is locality. So for example, say you click a delete comment button in your application that you're developing, and something weird happens in the UI. It doesn't look right. If you're using Flux, then you know that if the bug is related to the application data changing in a way that it shouldn't have been changed, then there's a very finite number of places that you need to look. One would be the place where you're clicking the button and actually dispatching the action to the stores, just to make sure that you're dispatching the right action and it has the right parameters associated with it. And the only other place you need to check are any of the stores that respond to that particular action, because that's the only way that the application state can be changed.
Just to make this more concrete for people, can you describe the relationship between the view and the dispatcher and the stores in Flux?
Absolutely. Yeah, I kind of glossed over that. The dispatcher it's a key piece, I think, to the Flux architecture, but I don't think it necessarily deserves a lot of attention. It's kind of a middleware piece between the views and the stores. Essentially, all the dispatcher does is keep track of the list of your stores. And when you ask the dispatcher, "Hey, I want to add a comment," the dispatcher is the thing that's responsible for telling all of the stores, like, hey, someone wants to add a comment. If you happen to care about this action, please do your thing. So from the point of view of a React component, all you're really doing is saying like, hey, someone out there, I'm dispatching an action that should add a comment, and you don't have to worry about the stores that are attached to the dispatcher. The dispatcher kind of manages that for you. So I guess on a higher level, it's the views talk either directly or indirectly through some method to a dispatcher. A dispatcher has a list of stores that it dispatches to, and then the stores are generally event emitters or some other sort of observable that the views watch, and whenever the data changes, the React views will re-render themselves.
Is Flux a replacement for ModelViewController?
I think so, and actually, if you look at the Fluxxor website, that's one of the main comparisons that I make on the What is Flux page.
Does that seem heretical?
I think it can sound heretical, and I think that's because other than a few.
How old is MVC?
Oh man, I'm not even sure, and there's not. I've heard of patterns like there's the model view presenter kind of pattern and a couple others, but for the most part, I mean MVC goes all the way back to like the Smalltalk days, I guess.
I know it's old. I don't know. That's I don't know. I guess that dates both of us. Yeah. Or doesn't date both of us. If neither of us have any idea what the origin of ModelViewController, I thought it was like handed down with the 10 Commandments from God. So okay, that's interesting. So maybe it's a replacement for ModelViewController. Is it an evolution of ModelViewController? Like, are there how can we draw similarities for people who are coming from the ModelViewController world? What are the analogs? Like, is the model, for example, analogous to a store?
In some ways, it is, and I think this is a little bit why the Flux pattern was and maybe still is hard for people who are new to the idea to grasp, which is actually the reason I wrote Fluxxor in the first place, and it's because there's not a lot of direct one-to-one mappings between the two. I think there are a lot of ideas that are like, oh, that looks kind of like this half of the model, and this is kind of sort of like a controller, but there aren't really a lot of one-to-one mappings. On a really, really, really broad level, a store could kind of be considered the model in that it holds your state, and the dispatcher could sort of kind of be considered a controller in that it notifies the stores that things need to change. But the control is inverted, where in a ModelViewController, your controller generally tells the model what to do, and in Flux, the dispatcher just tells the stores that there was some intent and asks them to take care of the details.
Right. What are the hazards of ModelViewController? Why do we want to move beyond ModelViewController?
For me, there's this specific class of bugs that MVC apps tend to migrate toward, I guess, for lack of a better term. And that is a situation where you have, you've got some number of views, generally a relatively high number of views in any sort of moderately complex app. And these different views are watching one or more models for these models to change. And when these models change, if you're doing things really well, you've got some sort of declarative view binding system that you're using, but a lot of times you're just watching for some model to change and you're manually adding or removing a class on some DOM node somewhere. And it's really, really easy, one, for the DOM to get out of sync with the data that you think you have by messing up some logic somewhere. And the other is that when you click a button in your application and things change, it's very, very difficult to figure out why those things changed. Any number of models could have emitted change events. Any number of views could have called methods on who knows what. And, it very much, it's the opposite of the Flux ideology of having a very local, the bugs are very local, where this is like much more of a global concern, and you kind of have to grep through the whole code base to figure out what's going on.
Are you describing the cascading update problem?
Partially. I think that's part of what I was describing, and it's definitely one of the issues. I think the other issue is just it's just a matter of the number of dependencies. If you look at diagrams that of kind of a Flux architecture, you'll generally see a relatively linear, or I guess sort of a circular path, but it's a very one-way data flow. The data comes out of the stores into the React views, actions come out of the React views into the dispatcher, and it's a relatively easy flow to follow. But if you modeled the views and the models in an MVC app, chances are you'll see a much more convoluted graph. And even if okay, this model changed this field, it's still very difficult to know the eventual effects that might have on the application.
Does Flux bear some similarities to a pub/sub system?
Yeah, I guess in some ways. I guess it's not exactly the same, but in so much as the dispatcher, basically publishes out these actions to the stores, and the stores don't so much subscribe to them, I guess. The dispatcher sends every action to every store, and then the store just decides if it needs to respond to that action or not.
I see. So why does Flux work so well with React? Like, we're talking about this ModelViewController transition to Flux. Why is that specifically inspired by React?
Yeah, and I think it's a very interesting question, and I actually think that Flux will not work nearly as well for any view system that doesn't have kind of the always re-render mindset, as it were. And I think probably the best way to think about Flux is if you take React and its properties to take the same props and always render the same thing, and work backwards from that, like finding kind of the ideal data management system that you might end up with something that looks like Flux. And so the reason this works so well is when a store changes its internal data, all it says is, hey, I changed. There's no details about what changed. There's no specific events to bind to. It's just that any React component that relies on data from that store will see that the store will change, fetch all of the necessary data, and re-render itself.
What is Fluxxor?
So Fluxxor is a relatively small, very basic library that is essentially an implementation of the Flux design pattern as described by Facebook.
Okay, and why did you write Fluxxor?
When Facebook first started talking about Flux, I found it very interesting, and I think a lot of other people found it very interesting, and there was a lot of buzz about it. But they didn't really share any code or any implementations. They're like, here's kind of the idea, here's kind of the problem that it solves, hope you like it. And that was kind of the end of it. And the more I tried to kind of wrap my head around this new and interesting paradigm, the more I thought, like, maybe the best way to do this is just to implement it, and implement it in a generic way that I can use on multiple applications and see what it looks like. And so that's where Fluxxor was born. And then after I wrote it, I thought, well, if I found it useful, maybe other people will find it useful. So I threw it up on GitHub.
And how has the adoption been?
The adoption's been really good. So I'm pretty sure Fluxxor was the first Flux framework. And it's still, one of my goals was to relatively closely follow the design pattern as Facebook described it. So kind of a vanilla implementation of Flux, as it were. And it got a really good response. I actually I had an entire morning of, the morning I was going to publish it, I had it all planned out. I was going to finish getting ready for work, and I was going to, push the web page up, and I was going to post to Reddit, and I was going to post to Twitter, and all this other kind of stuff. And it came to my attention that the original name for Fluxxor, which was Fluxbox, is already taken. It's a window manager for Linux, which I knew but forgot. Yeah, so someone opened an issue, and I'm like, oh, you're totally right. Before I do all this stuff, I'll just change the name, I'll re-register the website, I'll migrate, all the DNS stuff will be great. And as I was doing that, I got an email from Viju, I believe, who was like, hey, I know you've been asked to change the name of your project, but it's doing really well on Reddit, and there's a tweet going around. Could you please bring it back? And I had no clue that this had already made it out into the internet and that people were already looking at this.
Oh, wow. Fascinating.
Yeah. So anyway, I kind of got that all sorted out. And
how did it get discovered if you hadn't blasted it on the social media?
I'm really not sure. I'm trying to remember now. I ended up tracking down the post on Reddit that shown it, but I guess, when I had pushed it, the night before or whatever, that someone happened to see it and was like, oh, hey, look at this.
That's fascinating. So, it sounds like you wrote Fluxxor as an effort to actually just learn how Flux works. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's very accurate, and in a way that can kind of be generic enough to use for more than one app.
Yeah, I think that actually speaks to something. I think the times where I've actually gained an intimate understanding of something, it is only by doing. Like, it's very rare that I can just like stare at a textbook or some flow chart, like the Flux. For all the staring at Flux charts I've done, you can't really learn how it works without really getting into the weeds of working with it, or to take it to the extreme, actually writing a framework that supports it.
Absolutely, yeah, and then that's exactly the situation I found myself in. I was really interested in this idea, but just couldn't quite imagine what it would look like or how it would work, and there were questions about how do you handle asynchronicity, an AJAX request, and all this kind of stuff, and it was just didn't feel like I was getting anywhere just sitting around and thinking about it.
So you mentioned that asynchronicity in most JavaScript web applications, you need to fetch data from an external data source at some point. I mean, you're on the web, you're interacting with all these different feeds of data, and it's often ambiguous how long that will take. So this necessitates some asynchronous data fetching. How does Fluxxor handle the asynchronous data fetching?
Yeah, so Fluxxor doesn't really prescribe any particular way of dealing with this. It's a fairly generic tool. It gives you the tool for dispatching and handling actions and managing stores and sending the change events and that sort of thing. But I think there's a pattern that I recommend and that a lot of other people that use a vanilla Flux implementation use, and that is inserting a new abstraction between the components, between your views and the actual dispatching of an action, and these are called action creators. And all an action creator does is help coordinate some other piece of sometimes asynchronous logic that needs to happen before you dispatch an action. So for example, if you post a comment, you'll call an action creator called something like add comment. And the first thing that action creator will do will dispatch some sort of optimistic action that says, "Dear stores, the user wants to add a comment. We're going to assume this is going to work, so go ahead and modify your data so that when the views render, it looks like the comment was created." In the meantime, we'll fire off an AJAX request, via some data layer that actually posts the comment to the server. And then when that request either succeeds or fails some point in the future, we will dispatch another action letting you know whether this succeeded or failed, and you can re-modify your state as necessary.
Okay, I understand. And you recommend using React Router with Fluxxor. What do you like about React Router?
Oh, what is there not to like about React Router? React Router is great. Those guys have done a great job. I had the privilege of meeting Michael Jackson at a meetup that we hosted at work.
Yeah, he's a great evangelist.
He is. He's great, and I don't know how those folks get so much done. But React Router is. Take a step back. So Ryan Florence uses this phrase a lot, and I really, really like it. And it's something along the lines of, JSX or React can describe a tree of things. Sometimes that's a DOM tree. It's describing your views, but it doesn't have to be. And so he's kind of in this epiphanic state, I guess, where he's realized that he can use React to describe this, any sort of tree of data, and this is kind of what React Router is all about. And so you describe your routing hierarchy the same way that you would kind of describe a view in JSX in React component using JSX, and the new APIs that they have. I believe 1.0 RC1 is out as of this time, and it's really nice. It has everything you need, and still like a really simple API.
One thing I find interesting about React Router, and I was actually talking to Michael Jackson about this, is when I initially was looking at React, my understanding was like, okay, you're building these components, and they're all visual components, they're all user interface components, but then you look at the router, and you're like, this isn't a visual component. Your router is not something that's visible to the user. And so, I asked him if he thought that we're moving, at least in the context of React, if we're moving towards like a component-oriented programming style, or where we're just programming in components and creating logic between them? Because a component doesn't. I mean, I guess it feels kind of like a class. I guess it is sort of like a class. But do you think that is there like a new paradigm coming here, like, or is this just like yet another version of object-oriented programming?
I think it feels like a new paradigm sometime, but really, like if you have a React component and it doesn't have any state, you never call set state or you never use this dot state, then essentially all you have is a function that takes props and returns some JSX. And so I think what React really is functional programming. And I think that's where actually a lot of the power from React is coming from. And so when he says something like, when I hear someone say something like component-oriented programming, in this kind of context, I really think that's actually functional programming. And I think React has done a good job of taking this concept that's always sounded fairly academic and maybe a little nerdy, and packaging it in a way that's useful and that people can get work done with.
Talk about that more. Why is functional programming so desirable?
So, I mean, I guess there's a few properties of functional programming that make it nice to use. The first one is that, mutable state tends to be pushed to the boundaries of the system. Flux is a great example. Some of my favorite Flux applications have been in projects where none of the components actually have any local state, where all the state is actually stored inside the Flux stores. So none of the components ever call, set state. All they do is display their properties and call functions, passed in as properties when they're clicked. And functional programming is nice in that regard, in the same way that you say a React component is nice to work with, because if you get the same props and you have the same state, that it's going to return the same thing. And so these functional programming paradigms are easier to reason about for the same reason. Given the same input, you always have the same output. They're also easier to compose, which is another property we always say is nice with React components, but really I think it's just a property of functional programming that you can compose functions in the same way that you can compose components.
I'd like to get back to talking about Fluxxor. We've talked about Flux in the abstract, and we've talked some about your Fluxxor implementation. You have a number of examples on the Fluxxor website, which I'll put in the show notes, and your documentation is really good. Your examples are awesome.
Thank you.
Could you walk through one of your examples and describe how the different aspects of that example slot into the aspects of the Flux architecture?
Sure. So the most basic example I have on the site is the little to-do app, which is actually marketed as the Getting Started guide. And the goal is basically to write as little code as possible to get a real Flux-based React application up and running. It's very, very simple. So I believe toward the top of the file we declare a couple of action types, like adding a to-do, marking a to-do as completed, and clearing all the completed to-dos. And one of the things that, back up a second, and then we have one store in this application, and the store I believe is called the to-do store, and it's fairly straightforward. It does what you think it would do, and that is hold the state of the current to-do list. And you can see in the initialize method of that store that we tell the store that when it sees these certain actions, we're going to call these functions inside the store. And those functions mutate some internal state that we have that keeps track of the array of to-dos. And at the end of that operation, it emits a to-do event so that the components that watch that store knows that the store has changed. And then the components are also fairly straightforward. Fluxxor ships with a couple of mix-ins that, the goal is to help the goal of the mix-ins was to make getting data out of the stores and into a React component a little bit simpler. And I think there are some newer, better paradigms that I'll be working into newer versions of Fluxxor, but the one that ships with it is called the store watch mix-in. And all you do is pass it a list of stores that you want to watch. And then when any of them emit a change event, it will call some function this function should return any new state that you want to set from the Fluxxor, and then it will set that state for you. And of course, your React component will re-render because the state has changed.
Could you describe some of those newer, better paradigms you're going to be working into?
Sure, yeah, and I think a lot of the newer Flux implementations and the Flux-inspired implementations really got this right. In particular, the React guys and Dan Abramov, who you chatted to recently with React D&D, got this idea very correct of a higher order component, and that is, ideally your React components would just take in state and then render things. And, maybe when you click on a DOM, it calls some function that's also passed in as prop. I'm sorry. I believe I said would only take in state. I meant only take in props.
That's fine.
And the problem, I think, with the StoreWatch mix-in and that ships with Fluxxor is that it mixes this into your state. And of course, in a React component, you can modify the state by calling set state. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. And I think a much better pattern is to declaratively say, okay, I have these stores. Whenever they change, here's a function that will take the data in these stores and translate them into props. And then these props will be sent to my component. And one of the really nice properties about that is, one, it helps make the components more reusable because they just take props. They're not tied to any specific store. And for that purpose, they're also much easier to test because in a testing environment, you can just pass them whatever props.
So you mentioned Dan Abramov. We had him on the show yesterday. He's the author of Redux, which is sort of a different take on Flux. What is your opinion of Redux?
Redux is great. I haven't looked into it nearly as much as I would like to. It's funny. I mean, these things are starting to become so popular. I managed an interview where I work today, and the gentleman that was interviewing with us wrote his little homework app in React and Redux, which I thought was great. And I really like the ideas behind Redux. Really, really embraces a lot of kind of the functional paradigms, I think. I think at first Redux struck me as a little complex and a little hard to understand. There was a lot of scary words like funks and that sort of thing. But I think the abstraction that they found is really quite nice. And I think it's extremely flexible, as demonstrated by how easy it is to build dev tools for it. You pop it in as part of your reducer. So anyway, I like it a lot. I think it's a nice evolution on kind of the Flux ideas. I still think that a lot of people will still use Flux. I still use Flux for things at work and things on personal projects as well.
Yeah, I think maybe Dan seems to have been heavily influenced by reading a book about Erlang as a teenager. So I think that it was like a traumatic event for him. Maybe it's like, I don't know, it seems like a superpower now, though, if it's all, if we're moving towards such a functional paradigm. So Dan also created React Hotloader and React D&D, and you said that you have used these tools and you have benefited from them. It would be great to hear how you use them and how they assist your development.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I haven't used React Hotloader myself, but I have used React D&D, and React D&D was another one of those projects which at first can look a little intimidating because there's a lot of terminology to use. And if you're used to drag and drop with something like jQuery UI, you're like, man, I just want a draggable and I want a droppable. What's so hard about this? But the abstraction that Dan has built with React D&D is one that's extremely flexible and one that puts the data as the first class citizen. So the fact that you're dragging around a DOM node is really kind of an implementation detail. You don't really deal with DOM nodes. You deal with data. And similar to the higher order components we were talking about, with hooking up Flux source to components, there are also, these higher order components that will, take this declarative, this set of functions that declares how the data should be transformed when things get dragged and things get dropped, and wrap your component in a component that injects the necessary properties to make all that work into component.
Interesting. What are the subjective aspects of Flux that lead to so many different implementations? Like, there's been this Cambrian explosion of different types of implementations. There's yours, obviously. There's Redux, and then there's a trillion others. Why are there so many?
I think there were a few things that actually led to kind of the explosion of Flux and Flux-inspired libraries. I think the first one is that like we were already talking about before, when there's something that you want to try to understand, a good way to do that is to try to implement it. There's the old saying, like, you shouldn't reinvent the wheel unless you want to learn a lot about wheels. And I think in this case, people wanted to learn.
I've never heard that phrase. Who says that?
I'm sure someone says it.
It's pretty funny.
But it's true. It's a good way to kind of dig into that and learn about it. I think another reason is that Flux, while presenting some ideas that maybe were a little more complex or kind of a shift from the way people were thinking about programming, it's actually not that complex. So the amount of code that you actually need to write is not that high, and that's still the case. Even with Fluxxor today, it's not a very big project. You could sit down and read all the source code and probably understand it really well in 15, 20 minutes. And then the subjective piece, I think, that caused people to want to try to improve things or change things, I think, is mostly around the boilerplate that vanilla Flux requires. And this is still an issue that I have as well with Flux, and I'm very interested in people's ideas to making this less verbose. I think this is another thing that Redux is doing very well. But there's a sentiment that if you want to add some new interaction to your app, you create some new action creator that dispatches an action. Well, that means you need to have some new action type, which usually involves editing some constants. And then for all the stores that care about that action, you need to have some new way of responding to that action. And then also you need to edit your React component to call the function. And so this is 4 or 5 places that you're editing your application anytime you want to add an interaction. I personally like the explicitness of it. One of the things I like about Flux is how explicit it is and how it helps manage the amount of code you need to search through to figure out what's going on. And so I think that's a trade-off I've been happier with than other people. But a lot of other implementations are doing things like letting you return promises from your action creators and automatically dispatching and that sort of thing.
Is Fluxxor the first large open source project you've worked on?
It's certainly the most popular. There were 2 other projects that I worked on that were approximately as popular as Fluxxor. One was an infinite scroll widget for AngularJS. I used to do a lot of AngularJS. I was a huge Angular enthusiast for a long time. And I've since handed that off to someone else on GitHub since I no longer really work with Angular. And the other is this crazy idea of a project I had, which just shows little rotating globes on a canvas, and it's got kind of this plugin interface, and you can display animated pings on the map and stuff. But I think this is the first really serious, useful thing that's gotten any sort of attention.
Did your move to React, did that coincide with your move away from Angular?
Yeah, actually, it did. And there were a few reasons for that. One of them was, when I started working at Minerva, they didn't use Angular, and I had introduced Angular at a previous job and used Angular on a very large Angular code base, kind of in between. And then at Minerva, they weren't using Angular at all, so it kind of gave me time to explore other technologies and stuff. And I think this kind of coincided with about the time that Nathan had recommended that I check out React and give it another chance.
So people have talked about Angular adopting some of the ideas of React. Is there anything stopping Angular from becoming extremely similar to React? Or is there some fundamental two-way data binding hurdle that Angular cannot overcome to become to take advantage of the things that React can take advantage of?
Right. I haven't been following it as closely as I was at the beginning. I definitely think, from what I could understand, and I could be way off base here, from what I could understand about it, Angular was adopting some of these ideas, but not enforcing them. So I think if the developer, was willing to, give up some of this two-way data binding stuff and embrace more of a functional one-way data flow, that you could definitely reap some of these rewards. And the fact of the matter is, you can do something very similar to React in terms of how you structure your application, not in terms of the virtual DOM and the re-rendering bit, but you can do that with directives. But you also kind of go against the grain of a lot of what Angular does already.
When you're at work, do you find yourself thinking about your open source project, or do you find that your interests are lying equally with your actual work creating the Minerva Project? Are you just as fascinated by that as your personal hobby project?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of overlap there. I mean, I think this is a common sentiment, but as a developer, I like making things that make my and other developers' life easier. And obviously, if I'm using a technology, I believe in it for one reason or another. And I've introduced some React at work, and Fluxxor is being used for a couple of projects as well. I've given an internal brown bag on React, and we kind of spent about an hour and a half working on some little example apps together and kind of
that
exploring.
Must be super gratifying.
It really is. It's I really enjoy sharing my passion for certain things with other people, especially programming related. And in this case, I feel like that this combination of React and Flux or something like it, could help make our developer experience better at work. So there's obviously a desire there to kind of help push that forward as well.
Have you thought about contributing to React itself?
I have, and I think I've issued a few small pull requests, I believe, in the past. A lot of this has to do with, I think maybe a couple of things. One of them is this kind of feeling of grandness of the project. React is a big project with a lot of big names behind it, a lot of kind of momentum. And sometimes it can feel hard to dive into the code base and really, work on it. The things that I've looked at in the past have been fairly self-contained, and I still felt, a little lost as I was trying to explore the code base. And the other thing is just the time to dedicate to it. With working at a small startup that's trying to do something, on the scale that we're doing, and also working on some, the personal open source projects. It's hard to devote the time that I would like to really dive in and really understand that code base.
There is a debate that I've come across while I'm doing research for this week of shows, and that's this debate between web components and React.js. I was talking to Michael Jackson about this, and he got very enthusiastic during this debate. But what's your view on the web components versus React debate?
Yeah, I haven't looked into web components probably as much as I should. I think I really started hearing about them about the same time as I got into React, and by that time I was already pretty in love with React and really didn't see a lot of need to look into web components. But I think in hindsight, the main difference between React and web components is that React is attempting to take the DOM out of the equation. The DOM is an afterthought, and the changes we're seeing in 0.14 further emphasize this. And with projects like, React Art and React Blessed, you're seeing that, React isn't about the DOM. It's about this declarative programming model for describing UIs or other pieces of data that I just don't think web components will be able to match that sort of versatility.
I see. So I would love to hear your take on where things are going with this larger buffet of different options that Facebook is creating. There's GraphQL, there's Relay, and these things are, complementary to Flux architecture and React. Have you messed around with these much? Have you used Relay or GraphQL?
I have. As a matter of fact, a couple of weeks ago, I started messing around with these, and it was another project that I was surprised that it took a little bit of time for me to like really get going and wrap my head around.
And you didn't implement your own?
No. A little ambitious for my taste. But the projects themselves are great. The ideas they present are wonderful. React already allows you to drop into such a declarative mindset for creating your components and for manipulating your DOM or your native app or whatever the case may be. And to be able to take that pattern and extend it to the data that you're fetching and the data that you're manipulating on the back end, I think is a natural extension of React.
Have you used React Native?
I haven't. So I have an Android device, so I was ever so patiently waiting for the release where Android support was enabled, and I saw just a couple of days ago that it's there, so it's on my to-do list.
Right, definitely. So where are you going with Fluxxor? Like, what is the future? You mentioned some objectives, but I'd love to hear where you're going with the project on a higher level. Sure,
yeah. This is something I've been thinking about a lot recently as I've started to have more time to work on it. And I think there are two big directions that I kind of want to go. And I don't know if this will all be in like version 2 or if maybe this will be over a longer period of time. One of them is to make kind of the underlying pieces more accessible and more extendable for people that want to get into those details. For example, right now, Fluxxor ships with a very basic store. Some people are like, oh, it'd be great if I could, have my own custom store that does really fancy stuff that I want to do. And right now, there's not a great way to do that in Fluxxor because some assumptions that are made, between the way the dispatcher and the store communicates with each other. So I'd like to, really kind of decouple that stuff as much as possible and make it to where you can use your own dispatcher, your own stores, your own different pieces of middleware and that sort of stuff. And that's kind of been a goal for a while. And the more recent goal has been around this idea that we talked about earlier of, providing a better API in terms of like getting state out of the store and into your components, providing higher order components. Fluxxor was written way before, React.component was a thing and before, ES classes were a thing. So there's some work that I need to do to, properly support those sort of patterns for people that don't use mix-ins and all that sort of thing.
What do you think of the Facebook engineering team as a whole? Like, I think their approach to open source and building technologies in general it seems very different and distinct from any other company out there. Do you agree with this? Do you think that they're doing stuff that's like, does it seem somehow like strikingly different than the other companies that are heavily involved in open source?
Yeah, in some ways. To be honest, Facebook, was the last company I expected, so much great open source engineering, to come out of. I think what in particular that impresses me with the Facebook open source is that they have this really good balance of polish for the projects that they release, but still releasing them early enough that they can get, community feedback and that sort of stuff. Relay is a great example. When I was using Relay, there were some rough edges around the documentation and the tutorial that, I gave as feedback to the team, but it was extremely usable and it worked very well, and so I think they've done a really good job of striking that balance. It's also nice to see a company that will, have open source projects and they're open source in more than just words. A lot of places I've worked, we want to do more, developer outreach, and one of those ways is having, open source projects, contribute to the open source community. It's easy to publish a package on GitHub, but it's not so easy to manage pull requests and issues and make sure things stay up to date. And the amount of time and energy that they dedicate to making sure those things happen is very impressive.
What are the big frustrations and the big issues that you continually have in web development?
Oh man, that's a very good question. I think one of the issues that I don't think it bothers me as much as some people, but it definitely affects me in that people that I work with and people that I interact with find this a problem in the ecosystem is the rate of change. And you hear this over and over again. The churn rate is very high. Things are changing very, very quickly. ES6 is just out the door, and we're already talking about ES Next and decorators and all these other things. And I think there's this general sense that things are in a bit of a frenzy, and people aren't really sure how to keep up. A lot of people were just figuring out Flux, and various implementations are still coming out, and now we're like, oh, by the way, we're talking about GraphQL and Relay now, and so I think that's something that will eventually come to a head, and that we'll need to find a way to deal with.
But do you think, is the velocity fast, or is it fast and increasing?
It's a good question. I can't help but wonder if it feels like it's increasing simply because of the number of people that are working on it.
Or the singularity.
Right. It's a good question. To be honest, I'm not 100% sure. Like I said, I don't have as much of an issue with the velocity or the seeming velocity because I enjoy experimenting with cutting edge libraries. But a good example was today as I was working with the interview candidate, that came in today and had his project in React and Redux. He wanted to show me the dev tools, and he went to install the dev tools, and the versions had already changed, and so the pure dependencies wouldn't resolve. So like in a day, we went from this project that was totally working fine to a project that needed some love in its dependency management. And I think that's just, I think it's a symptom of things maybe still settling down. I think, some of the ideas that React present are in no way new, but I think they packaged them in a way that developers didn't really have access to, and most front-end, client-side developers didn't have access to. If you weren't working in, more obscure languages, some of these ideas might be, totally new. And I think they kind of threw everyone up in the air, and everyone is still kind of landing and finding their place. And there's a good chance that this may settle down a little bit once the idea is kind of settled down.
In some sense, this type of really fast pace is super advantageous to a company like Facebook that's basically full of people that want to aggressively adopt stuff. So it almost seems like a competitive advantage for them to encourage this rate of change. Maybe not so much at a company that's kind of gotten swollen like Google. Maybe this is a strategic advantage.
Maybe. When it's all said and done, I think it's overall a good thing for the community. I think it's much better than the opposite alternative, which is stagnation. I would much rather be in an environment where there are too many choices and things are changing too fast for me to keep up than an environment where the tooling is not great and it doesn't seem to be changing.
Cool. Well, that seems like a good place to stop. Brandon Tilley, thanks for coming on to Software Engineering Daily. It's been great talking to you, and I will be following Fluxxor.
Thank you so much. It's great being here. I appreciate it.